The hospital was always buzzing with activity. The long white corridors smelled of antiseptic, and the sound of hurried footsteps never really faded away. Among the many doctors who worked there, one man stood out. Not for kindness or warmth, but for his sharp tongue and a pride that filled every room he walked into. He was the senior surgeon, a man who carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed he had nothing left to prove. He had been saving lives for decades, and he never missed a chance to remind everyone of it. His colleagues respected his skill, no doubt, but many quietly disliked his attitude. He rarely spoke to patients with compassion, and he treated junior staff as if they were in his way. When a new resident joined his team, his arrogance only grew louder. The young doctor was in her mid-20s, fresh out of medical school. She walked into the hospital on her first day with her stethoscope in hand and a quiet determination in her eyes. She was nervous, like anyone starting something so big, but she was also excited. Saving lives had been her dream since childhood. What she didn't expect was the constant belittling that was about to come her way. The first time she met the senior surgeon was during morning rounds. He stopped at a patient's bed, asked her a question about the diagnosis, and before she could even finish her answer, he cut her off with a smirk. "Textbook," he said in a mocking tone, turning to the nurses. "This is what you get with new doctors. They know the book, but they have no idea how to handle real blood and real pressure." The nurses looked uncomfortable, but they stayed quiet. The young doctor smiled faintly, lowered her eyes, and let the comment pass. She had heard about his reputation, but hearing it directly was harder than she thought. Day after day she faced similar remarks. Whenever she tried to suggest something, he dismissed her with a laugh. "Maybe in your notes, but not in real surgery," he would say, loud enough for the whole team to hear. In the cafeteria, other residents whispered about how he had treated them in the past. Some admitted they had given up trying to impress him. "He'll never respect you," one of them said, shaking his head. "Just keep your head down and survive the rotation." But the young doctor didn't want to just survive. Every insult stung, but instead of letting it break her, she let it push her forward. She stayed longer after her shifts, going through case histories and learning about rare conditions. When others went home, she stayed in the library or the staff room, reviewing surgical procedures and watching training videos. She even spoke to nurses, asking them about their experiences, because she knew they carried wisdom that books sometimes didn't. Despite all this, the senior surgeon never missed a chance to make her look small. One afternoon, a patient with severe chest pain was admitted. The young doctor quickly suggested an immediate test, but the surgeon laughed in front of everyone. "You want to waste time on that? This is why I keep saying, you people come with shiny degrees but no common sense." Hours later, it turned out the young doctor had been right. The patient's condition was exactly what she had suspected, but instead of admitting it, the surgeon brushed it off, saying, "Lucky guess." The nurses noticed, though. They saw her patience, her quiet dedication, and the way she treated patients with dignity. She would sit by their beds, listen to their fears, and explain things in simple words when the seniors were too busy. Patients often asked for her, saying she made them feel safe. One evening, while she was checking vitals on an elderly patient, a nurse whispered, "Don't let him crush you. You're better than he says." That simple line gave her strength. What the surgeon didn't realize was that every moment of belittling was shaping her. He thought he was proving she was weak, but in truth he was training her to be stronger than he ever imagined. Instead of walking away defeated, she became sharper, calmer, and more prepared. She didn't argue with him. She didn't talk back. She simply kept working, learning, and waiting. Deep inside, she carried a quiet confidence that someday an opportunity would come. An opportunity where her skills would speak louder than his insults. And when that moment arrived, she would be ready. That night, as she left the hospital, exhausted but still determined, she glanced back at the tall building glowing under the city lights. She whispered to herself, "One day, they'll see." And little did she know that day was coming sooner than she thought. The days turned into weeks, and the young doctor began to settle into her role, even if every morning felt like stepping into a battlefield. She carried herself with calmness, though inside she often felt the sting of the surgeon's sharp words. He didn't need to raise his voice to make her feel small. His sarcasm was enough. But where many would have grown bitter, she quietly chose a different path. Every night after her shift ended, she stayed back in the ward, checking on patients one last time. Sometimes she found little details the others missed: a rash, a slight change in breathing, a reaction to medication. She noted everything carefully, and the nurses soon noticed her thoroughness. While the senior surgeon dismissed her, the rest of the staff began to trust her. One evening, she was in the ward reviewing a patient's chart when an older nurse approached her. "You remind me of myself when I started," the nurse said softly, smiling with a touch of nostalgia. "Quiet but stubborn in the right way. Don't let him discourage you. He tests everyone. Most give up." The young doctor looked up, surprised. She wasn't used to compliments. "It's not easy," she admitted, her voice low. "Sometimes I feel invisible." The nurse chuckled and patted her arm. "Invisible maybe, but not forgotten. The patients see you. That matters more than his approval." Those words stayed with her. From that night onward, she stopped caring about whether the surgeon noticed her hard work. Instead, she focused on what truly mattered: the people lying in those hospital beds, scared and vulnerable, looking for someone to hold on to. Her compassion showed in small ways. If a patient's family looked confused after the surgeon's quick technical explanations, she would quietly follow them out and explain everything in plain language. When a child was frightened before a test, she sat by the bed and told stories to ease the fear. Sometimes, when she was on call, she even held the hands of patients who couldn't sleep, listening as they spoke about their lives outside the hospital walls. These moments didn't go unnoticed. Families began leaving notes of gratitude at the nurse's desk, sometimes mentioning her by name. The senior surgeon brushed these off, claiming bedside manners meant little compared to surgical skills. "You can hold their hand all you like," he scoffed one morning. "But at the end of the day, what saves them is a scalpel, not sympathy." The young doctor didn't argue. She knew he wouldn't understand. Instead, she held on to her own belief that medicine wasn't just about cutting and stitching. It was about treating the whole person, their body and their spirit. Still, the sting of his constant taunts was real. During surgeries, he often placed her in the corner, barely allowing her to assist. If she tried to ask questions, he snapped at her for distracting the team. When she suggested an alternative method once, he laughed and asked if she thought she was smarter than him. The rest of the room fell silent, and she swallowed her words, feeling her cheeks burn. That night, she sat in the hospital library long after everyone else had gone home. The quiet was broken only by the sound of her pen scratching against her notebook. She pulled out case files, medical journals, and surgical reports, determined to keep learning. Her eyes were tired, but her resolve burned brighter. She whispered to herself, "One day, knowledge will be my strength." Her effort slowly paid off. On ward rounds, she began noticing subtle signs the others overlooked. She diagnosed conditions faster, sometimes even before tests confirmed them. Patients started trusting her, asking for her opinion even when senior doctors were around. The surgeon noticed too, but instead of acknowledging it, he mocked her even harder. Deep down, though, it unsettled him. He had always believed that fresh graduates needed years before they were useful, but here was someone proving him wrong. Despite his behavior, the young doctor refused to develop bitterness toward him. She chose respect even when he gave her none. "He has experience I don't," she often reminded herself. "I can learn from what he does right, even if I ignore how he treats people." Her resolve only deepened after an encounter with a young patient. A teenager had been admitted after an accident, scared and in pain. The senior surgeon barely spoke to him, issuing instructions in a flat tone before moving on. Later that evening, the boy refused his treatment, saying he didn't trust the doctors. The young doctor sat by his bed and listened patiently. She spoke not with authority, but with kindness. By the time she left, the boy had agreed to continue. The next day, the surgeon noticed the patient cooperating and commented, "Strange. Maybe he finally realized we know better." The young doctor didn't correct him. She didn't need credit. The boy's trust was enough. Her long hours, however, began to take a toll. Some nights she barely slept. Her family worried, telling her she was working too hard, but she brushed it off. She wasn't driven by the need to prove the surgeon wrong. She was driven by the fear of letting her patients down. One rainy evening, as she walked home with her umbrella tilted against the wind, she thought about the journey so far. She had learned more in these months than she ever imagined, not because of his insults, but because she refused to let them crush her. She realized something important. Strength wasn't always about loudness or dominance. Sometimes strength was quiet. Sometimes it was staying calm in the storm, learning when others doubted you, and holding on when it would have been easier to give up. Back at the hospital, whispers about her started spreading, not negative ones, but quiet admiration. Nurses praised her diligence. Families spoke highly of her kindness. Other residents began asking her for help with tricky cases. Slowly, she was building a reputation of her own, one that didn't need the surgeon's validation. She didn't know it yet, but the long nights of studying, the hours of listening, and the patience she carried like armor were preparing her for a test far greater than anything she had faced before. A test that would not only change how the surgeon saw her, but how she saw herself. And when that moment finally came, all the days of being taunted and underestimated would fall into place. She would realize that everything she endured had quietly been shaping her into the doctor she was meant to be. It was late in the evening, the kind of evening when the hospital seemed quieter than usual, though the tension never really left. The long halls were dimly lit, and the sound of rolling trolleys echoed faintly. The young doctor was on call that night, sitting at her desk with patient files spread in front of her. Her eyes were tired, but she forced herself to stay alert. She had learned that emergencies never gave warnings. The calm was suddenly broken by the loud clatter of a stretcher being rushed into the emergency ward. Nurses called out to each other, and the steady beeping of a heart monitor filled the air. The young doctor rushed forward, her heart already racing. A middle-aged man had been brought in after collapsing suddenly. His skin was pale, his breathing shallow, and his pulse dangerously weak. Within minutes, the senior surgeon stormed into the room. His presence was as commanding as ever, and the nurses stepped aside immediately. He threw on his gloves and barked orders with the authority of someone who had handled hundreds of such cases before. The young doctor moved quickly to assist, standing by his side as he prepared for surgery. The patient's condition was critical, massive internal bleeding. The team wheeled him into the operating room, and the atmosphere grew heavier. The bright surgical lights shone down, reflecting on the metal instruments neatly laid out. Everyone took their positions, moving with precision, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. The surgeon began the operation, his hands moving quickly as he worked to stop the bleeding. For a while, everything seemed under control. The team followed his instructions, and the young doctor handed him instruments as he called for them. But then, without warning, the patient's blood pressure began to drop rapidly. The monitor alarmed loudly, filling the room with a piercing sound that sent a wave of panic through everyone present. The surgeon froze for a moment, his eyes darting to the monitor. "Pressure's crashing," a nurse called out. The young doctor felt her stomach tighten, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had studied cases like this before, though seeing it happen in real life was terrifying. The surgeon tried to adjust his approach, but the bleeding wasn't stopping. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he issued more instructions, his voice sharper now, almost desperate. "More suction. Clamp here." "No, not like that." His confidence, the same arrogance that had once seemed unshakable, began to waver in front of the team. The young doctor watched closely, her mind racing. Something about the bleeding looked different, not like the usual cases she had read about. Then, almost like a memory flashing back, she recalled a rare complication she had once studied late at night in the library. She remembered reading about a hidden arterial tear that could cause sudden collapse during surgery, and the description matched what she was seeing now. Her hands trembled slightly, but she steadied them. She knew what needed to be done. Taking a deep breath, she spoke up, her voice firm despite her pounding heart. "I think the bleeding is from a hidden arterial tear. We need to clamp higher up before it's too late." The room fell silent for a moment, except for the shrill beeping of the monitor. The surgeon turned to her with a glare. His pride stung even in the middle of an emergency. "Do you really think you know better than me?" he snapped. His tone was cutting, dismissive, the same way he had spoken to her so many times before. The nurses looked from him to her, uncertainty on their faces. The patient's condition was deteriorating quickly, and they all knew time was running out. The young doctor felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She could stay quiet and let the surgeon continue, or she could risk everything by insisting. Her voice didn't shake this time. "Please, let me try. If I'm wrong, we lose nothing. But if I'm right, it could save him." The surgeon hesitated, his hands hovering uncertainly. For the first time, his confidence seemed cracked. The alarms grew louder and the patient's body began to weaken before their eyes. The team was looking to someone, anyone, for direction. Before he could refuse again, the young doctor stepped forward. With calm but urgent movements, she positioned the clamp where she believed the tear was. The surgeon looked ready to scold her, but in that instant the bleeding began to slow. The monitor beeped less frantically. The patient's pressure started to rise little by little. Everyone in the room froze in disbelief. The surgeon stared at the monitor, then at the patient, then back at her hands. The young doctor continued her work with steady focus. Her heart still racing, but her hands sure. Within minutes, the bleeding was controlled and the patient's vitals stabilized. The room exhaled as one, a collective sigh of relief. The nurses exchanged glances, their eyes wide with astonishment. No one spoke, as if breaking the silence would undo the miracle that had just happened. The surgeon slowly stepped back, his face pale under the surgical lights. His arrogance, so strong and unshakable in every other situation, had crumbled in that moment. For the first time, he had been forced to see the young doctor not as a trainee, not as someone to mock, but as a true doctor who had just saved a life in front of everyone. The young doctor didn't celebrate. She didn't smile or look for recognition. She simply continued working, making sure everything was secure before finally stepping away. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, but her face remained calm. As the team finished up, the nurses began whispering quietly to one another, their eyes filled with respect. They knew what had just happened, and they knew they had witnessed something remarkable. The surgeon removed his gloves in silence. For once, he didn't have a sharp comment or a mocking smile. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he walked out of the operating room, leaving the rest of the team in stunned silence. The young doctor stood there, breathing deeply, her hands still trembling now that the adrenaline was fading. She glanced at the patient, alive because she had trusted her knowledge and her instincts. It felt unreal, like the nights of studying, the insults she endured, and the quiet determination had all built up to this very moment. In the hallway outside, whispers were already spreading. Word of what had happened in the operating room traveled fast. The staff who had once seen her as just another fresh graduate now looked at her with admiration. For the first time, she wasn't invisible, and though she didn't know it yet, this single night would change everything. Not just for her, but for the surgeon who had spent weeks mocking her. The operating room had finally quieted down, but the memory of what just happened still hung heavy in the air. Everyone moved slowly as though they were still processing it. The young doctor stepped aside to remove her gloves, her breathing finally starting to steady. She had just gone against everything she had been told to do. She had spoken out, challenged the senior surgeon, and acted when no one else dared. And against all odds, she had saved a life. But instead of pride, she felt an overwhelming exhaustion. The weight of the moment pressed down on her shoulders. She hadn't acted to prove herself or to embarrass anyone. She had acted because she couldn't stand by and watch a patient die when she knew what needed to be done. It was instinct mixed with knowledge, courage mixed with fear. Now that it was over, her hands trembled and her knees felt weak. The nurses gave her quiet nods of respect as they wheeled the patient out. Their eyes said what their mouths didn't. They knew she had been the one who turned the tide. For the first time, they weren't looking at her as the young resident, but as a real doctor, one they could trust in a crisis. She slipped out of the operating room into the long corridor, the white walls glowing under the fluorescent lights. She leaned against the wall for a moment, closing her eyes. She thought about the long nights she had spent studying, the countless times she had been mocked and dismissed, the tears she had hidden when no one was watching. All of that had led to this. And now she had proved, to herself most of all, that she wasn't weak, that she belonged here. The surgeon, meanwhile, hadn't said a word. He had left the operating room quickly, his face pale, his usual arrogance replaced by something unfamiliar. He had spent years commanding every room he entered, never questioned, never challenged. Tonight, for the first time, he had been forced to step back while someone else, someone he considered inexperienced, had taken control and succeeded. In the staff lounge, the young doctor sat down with a cup of water, trying to calm herself. A nurse came in quietly and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You saved him," the nurse said simply. The young doctor gave a tired smile. "We saved him," she replied, though deep inside she knew what had really happened. Word spread quickly through the hospital. By the next morning, residents were whispering in the hallways about how she had stepped in during the surgery. Some were wide-eyed with admiration, while others were in disbelief. "She really did that?" one asked. "In front of him," another replied. The story grew as it traveled, but the core of it remained true. She had saved a patient when even the most senior surgeon had been at a loss. The surgeon avoided her the next day. During rounds, he hardly spoke to her, as if ignoring her would erase what had happened. But the nurses noticed the change. He didn't mock her like before, and though he didn't praise her either, his silence was louder than any insult he had ever thrown her way. For the young doctor, the real change wasn't in him, but in herself. She felt a quiet confidence she hadn't known before. She no longer doubted whether she belonged in the hospital. She no longer questioned whether her efforts mattered. She had faced the ultimate test, and she had passed. Now, when she looked at her patients, she carried herself with a steadiness that even the families could feel. One evening, a patient's daughter stopped her in the hallway. "Thank you for caring about my father," she said, her eyes full of gratitude. The young doctor was taken aback. "He's getting stronger every day," she replied softly. The daughter nodded. "It's not just the medicine. It's the way you speak to him. It gives him hope." Those words meant more to her than any recognition from the surgeon ever could. She realized then that medicine wasn't about winning approval from superiors. It was about the trust of those who put their lives in your hands, and she was earning that trust day by day. Still, the memory of the surgery lingered. She replayed it in her head at night, sometimes wondering if she had just been lucky, but deep down she knew it wasn't luck. It was preparation meeting the moment. It was the hours she had spent in the library, the times she had stayed late to ask questions, the courage to believe in her knowledge even when others doubted her. The surgeon, on the other hand, struggled with his pride. In meetings, he avoided mentioning the case. He continued to act as though he was untouchable, but the nurses whispered that he had been shaken. "He's different," one of them remarked quietly. "He looks smaller somehow." They didn't mean physically smaller, but less towering, less invincible. His arrogance had taken a hit, even if he refused to admit it. The young doctor didn't wish him ill. In fact, she still respected his experience. She knew he had saved countless lives before she ever stepped into the hospital, but she also knew that skill alone wasn't enough without humility. That was the lesson she carried forward. A doctor wasn't just someone who could operate, but someone who could listen, learn, and admit when they didn't have all the answers. A week later, the patient she had saved was sitting up in bed, smiling weakly at his family. When she walked into the room, his wife grabbed her hand with tears in her eyes. "You gave him back to us," she whispered. The young doctor's throat tightened. She didn't know how to respond, so she simply squeezed the woman's hand in return. That moment reminded her why she had chosen this path. Back in the corridor, she saw the surgeon standing at a distance, watching silently. For a brief moment, their eyes met. He didn't say anything, but there was no mocking smile this time, no sarcastic remark. Just silence, heavy and awkward, as though he was still trying to make sense of it all. The young doctor walked past him without a word, not out of disrespect, but because she didn't need his validation anymore. She had found her strength in the patients she cared for, in the trust she had earned, and in the life she had saved when it mattered most. The hospital continued its usual rhythm, stretchers rolling, monitors beeping, families waiting with anxious hearts, but for her, everything felt different now. She was no longer the same quiet resident who had walked in weeks ago, intimidated by every harsh word. She was becoming the doctor she had always dreamed of being, steady, compassionate, and ready for whatever challenge came next. And though the surgeon still stood tall in his authority, deep inside he knew something had shifted. He had been forced to witness the truth. That skill and heart together were stronger than arrogance could ever be. What neither of them knew was that this was only the beginning. Greater challenges lay ahead, and the test of courage and humility was far from over. But for now, the young doctor walked the halls with a newfound strength, and even the whispers in the hospital carried a different tone when they spoke her name. The days after the surgery passed quickly, but the memory of that night refused to fade. The young doctor carried on with her usual duties, quietly moving from patient to patient, writing notes, checking vitals, and explaining treatments to worried families. On the surface, nothing seemed different, but deep inside she knew things had changed. The weight of doubt that once pressed on her shoulders was gone. She walked with a steady calmness now, no longer second-guessing her place in the hospital. Patients looked at her differently too. They smiled when she entered their rooms, sometimes asking for her by name. Families trusted her explanations, often nodding with relief when she spoke in her simple, patient way. Even the nurses seemed to lean on her more than before. They sought her advice, asked her opinion, and treated her as though she had been part of the team for years. The surgeon, however, remained distant. He rarely addressed her during rounds. When he did, his words lacked the usual sting. It wasn't praise, but it wasn't mockery either. It was as if he no longer knew how to speak to her. His arrogance, once a shield he wore proudly, had been cracked the night she saved the patient. Everyone had seen it, and so had he. One afternoon, while checking on the man she had operated on, she found him sitting up in bed, laughing softly with his wife and children. His cheeks had regained their color and his smile was warm. When he noticed her, he reached for her hand. "You gave me a second chance," he said quietly. His voice was heavy with gratitude and his wife's eyes filled with tears. The young doctor shook her head gently. "You're the one fighting. We're just helping." But he didn't let go of her hand. "Don't be modest. We all know what you did that night." His words echoed in her heart long after she left the room. As she stepped out into the hallway, she saw the surgeon watching from a distance again. He didn't speak, but his eyes followed her. For a moment she wondered what was going on in his mind. Was it regret? Was it respect he didn't know how to show? She would never know for sure, but one thing was clear. His silence was no longer filled with contempt. It was different now. Later that evening, in the staff room, a few residents gathered to discuss cases. One of them leaned toward her and whispered, "We heard about what happened in the operating room. That took courage." She felt her cheeks warm, not out of embarrassment but because she wasn't used to recognition. She gave a small smile and replied simply, "I just did what needed to be done." It was true. She hadn't acted to prove herself. She hadn't acted to silence the surgeon's arrogance. She had acted because in that critical moment, she knew the patient needed her to, and that was enough. But still, late at night when she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she thought about how everything had unfolded. She thought about the surgeon's face when the bleeding stopped, the way his pride crumbled in silence. She thought about all the nights she had stayed back studying, the tears she had hidden, the insults she had endured. For so long she had carried doubt like a shadow. But that night, she realized something important. Sometimes the respect you seek from others never comes until you stop needing it. The next week, during morning rounds, the surgeon finally spoke. They were standing in front of a patient's bed, surrounded by nurses and residents. He asked her for her opinion on a case, a genuine question, not a mocking test. The room fell silent, everyone waiting to see what would happen. The young doctor answered calmly, laying out her thoughts step by step. He listened, nodded slightly, and moved on without a single sarcastic comment. It was a small moment, but for everyone watching, it was enough to know that something had shifted. The nurses exchanged glances, some even smiling quietly. It was the first time they had seen him acknowledge her knowledge, even if indirectly. For the young doctor, it wasn't about his approval anymore, but it felt like a small piece of recognition, the kind that told her he could no longer deny her place on the team. That night, as she walked home under the dim glow of the streetlights, she thought about the journey she had taken. She had walked into the hospital as a nervous young resident, mocked and belittled at every step. She had endured sleepless nights, constant doubts, and endless criticism. But she had never let go of her purpose. She had kept going, learning quietly, caring deeply, and waiting patiently. And when the moment of truth came, she had been ready. The surgeon, too, changed in small ways after that. He was still proud, still commanding, but he no longer mocked her during surgeries. He gave her space to speak, sometimes even letting her assist in ways he never would have before. He never admitted out loud what she had done for the patient, but the entire hospital knew. And sometimes, respect doesn't come in words, it comes in silence, in actions, in the way people begin to treat you differently. Weeks later, the patient who had nearly died walked out of the hospital with his family by his side. Before leaving, he stopped at the nurse's desk and asked for her. When she arrived, he hugged her gently, tears in his eyes. "I owe my life to you," he whispered. She didn't know what to say, so she simply smiled and wished him health. Watching him walk away with his family felt like the greatest reward she could ever receive. The surgeon stood nearby, watching. For a long moment he stayed silent. Then, as the patient disappeared through the sliding doors, he turned to her. His voice was low, almost reluctant, but there was sincerity in it. "You did well," he said. Just 3 words, nothing more. But coming from him, they carried the weight of 1,000. She nodded respectfully, not gloating, not demanding more. She didn't need more. She had found her own strength long before those words left his mouth. But hearing them was a reminder that even the proudest walls can crack when truth is undeniable. The hospital went back to its usual rhythm, stretchers rolling, families waiting, doctors rushing, but for her, nothing would ever be the same. She had proven, not just to the surgeon, not just to the hospital, but to herself, that she was capable. She had faced the most difficult moment of her career and emerged stronger. And perhaps in his own way the surgeon had learned something too. That arrogance may command fear, but respect is earned in silence, in humility, and sometimes in learning from those we least expect. For the young doctor, the journey was far from over. There would be more sleepless nights, more challenges, more patients whose lives would hang in the balance. But now she carried within her a quiet certainty that no insult could shake. She had discovered what kind of doctor she truly was, not defined by someone else's arrogance, but by her own compassion, courage, and resolve. And as she walked the hospital halls, patients smiling at her, nurses nodding with respect, and colleagues looking to her for guidance, she realized something powerful. In the place where she had once felt invisible, she now stood tall. She no longer needed anyone's approval to know her worth. She had already proven it in the most undeniable way, by saving a life when it mattered most.